Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Wednesday, May 8th, 2024. I'm John Podhortz, the editor of Commentary. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John.
And Washington Commentary columnist and director of domestic policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
Two faces of Joe Biden yesterday. So we're going to start first with Joe Biden's noontime speech commemorating Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Seth, you watched the speech. What was your take on it?
There's nothing really wrong with the speech except for what was missing. Everything he said was basically right. He was sufficiently dismissive of the protesters, and the way he did it was, I think, very good and important, where at one point he said, we know that everybody has strong feelings about foreign policy or something like that. He didn't even name the conflict. He was just like, people have strong feelings. It doesn't matter. You can't push Jews around on campus. That was the essence of it, which is the important point, which is that it doesn't actually matter what's happening in Gaza at all when you're talking about somebody who's, throwing a bottle at a Jewish guy's head and telling him to go back to Poland, right? So Biden understood that, and the speech made that distinction, that it doesn't actually matter what you're upset about if that's how you act out your upsetness. But he
So what did he leave out?
But he left out the fact that people in his own party are egging this stuff on. He didn't talk about the fact that these encampments, which he rightfully criticized, get celebrity visits from members of Congress of his own party, like Ilhan Omar. After the hearing, Ilhan Omar's daughter goes to Barnard, and there was a sort of mini scandal where she got suspended, and they convinced the Daily Beast to write that she was homeless and foodless, and she was unhoused and unfed. And I kept thinking of So I Married an Axe Murderer and Unlove, Ed. She doing this whole. But it was.
By the way, that's a great movie. Let's just take a minute to pause and say, if you've never seen Mike Myers's So I Married an Axe Murderer, it is one of the unheralded comedies of the 1990s, and he plays a what did they call it? Talking word poet. I can't remember what the term was at the time.
Spoken word
slam poet. Anyway, unbelievably good. So yes, Unlove Ed. Yeah, is one of his formulations as he's poesying. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So she's, they made it into a whole big thing. So this was Ilhan Omar's daughter. So within the next couple of days after that happened, Ilhan Omar herself visited the Columbia encampment, and she was interviewed by a reporter and asked about I don't even remember whether the question was specifically about anti-Semitism or whatever, but she said, everybody deserves to feel safe on campus. All Jews, whether they're anti-genocide or pro-genocide. So
and there is a move, I believe right now, there is a move to censure her in Congress for this.
Don Bacon has introduced a resolution to censure her for that.
Right.
So this is what he left out. This is the problem, is that these encampments are not just independent of the Democratic Party's political process. They are part of, it's like a festival. It's like, are you going to, the Lollapalooza or something? Yeah. And it's turned into this kind of festival atmosphere, and his own, members of his own party who are somewhat influential are visiting. And then on the other hand, you also have people like Bernie Sanders and being echoed by Elizabeth Warren, who's just out there every day saying Israel is deliberately starving Palestinian children. I mean, those are his words. It's not even a characterization. It's not innuendo. And so, he gets up there and he talks correctly about the line that you can draw from anti-Semitism in the past through to the rise of the Nazis and the scapegoating of the Jews, and past that and all the way to October 7th. And then says, and since then, people are forgetting that Hamas is responsible for this, that Hamas started this, that, and the other. So he draws that line fully. He doesn't follow it to the next step, which is that, he was at some sort of policy rally or press conference with AOC last week and standing up there, and he made some comment like, I always told everybody to listen to her.
I always listen to this lady, right?
I always listen to this lady.
Listen to this lady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's, that's the two-facedness up there, is that Biden on the one hand is, he knows what she's doing is fueling the thing that he's giving a speech about. But then he has no problem not only appearing with her, but being like, oh, you got to listen to this lady. She knows what she's talking about.
And it's not just his party, it's his own administration. So as he was giving the speech, the reporting about the administration delaying delivery of munitions to Israel was gaining force. As he was speaking, his CIA director, Bill Burns, was in Cairo trying to force some type of agreement onto Israel not to go into Rafah. And as Biden was speaking, his administration was leaking to the Washington Post, some unnamed official, saying, we've decided Rafah is just not tenable. Israel can't go into Rafah, which means that Hamas would survive. And so it's not just a discrepancy between what Biden says and what others in his party is saying. It's a discrepancy between what Biden says and what his administration is doing that I think is worth noting. A couple other things I noticed about the speech. First was, I was grateful that he did not mention Islamophobia in the speech. I did a word search and it did not come up. That was a first, and I appreciated that he did focus on anti-Semitism. And the second thing I noticed too was it was short. It was about 20 minutes long. It was an event where other people were giving speeches for sure, but it is part of a pattern where Biden is shortening the length of his speeches, his aides tell Axios, in order to prevent him from going off script or going into the mumble word salad that sometimes happens when he talks. It's of a piece of this kind of occlusion of Biden that's taking place, whether it's speaking for a short amount of time, not giving many interviews. When you do give interviews, they're to friendly sources like late night talk show hosts or Howard Stern, not New York Times reporters say. The travel schedule is rather light, very few public events. When he has one, it's a big to-do. And then, of course, the phalanx of his aides who surround him whenever he walks so that people can't see his increasingly noticeable gait.
Okay, so two things. One, I have to apologize yesterday because I conflated William Burns, the CIA director, with Nicholas Burns, who was the State Department spokesman during the Obama years. And so I apologize for that brain skip. So I should maybe hold off on making fun of Biden, given my own behavior yesterday. But I also want to apologize because I was very skeptical when stories began to emerge late last week about the withholding of the munitions, because in part there was a story out of the Pentagon where someone at the Pentagon said that's not happening. Like, we are the ones who send the munitions. We're the War Department, and there has been we haven't been told to do anything like that. So apparently the message hadn't gotten through yet. It clearly has happened, that what the administration has decided to do is put its money where its mouth is. It does not want Israel to go into Rafah and is therefore attempting to withhold aspects of the aid that was approved by Congress to make Israel's move into Rafah more difficult and to complicate its war aims and war goals. And that is a new wrinkle in all wrinkles, because the line, as I understand it, we keep hearing they don't want them to go into Rafah. It's too dangerous for the civilians, or they can only do this if they have an evacuation plan for the civilians so that there isn't a humanitarian catastrophe. So Israel has an evacuation plan for the civilians that it is enacting as we speak, and has been enacting for the last 72 hours. They are being moved slightly north. There are tents for them. There's food, whatever. Okay. So they have complied with the American demand that they come up with an evacuation plan for those who are sheltering in Rafah, not the people who live it. Okay. So they are complying with that. They are negotiating in good faith with Hamas and Egypt and Qatar and the United States, putting proposals on the table, softening the proposals during the course of the last week. And what is happening now? Something shifted in the administration's approach. It is now decided that its purpose and its policy now is to prevent, to the extent possible, Israel's final blow against Hamas in Rafah. And the problem with that, aside from everything else that we can go to in detail, is that limiting our access to our precision weaponry, or the things that we can do to help them make the weaponry more precise, would have the effect of making the Rafah invasion bloodier, more civilian casualties rather than fewer, more Israeli casualties, and God knows what happens in the tunnels. Is that really what the United States wants? They want Israel.
Also,
yeah, okay, go ahead.
Also, with withholding arms is going to drag it out longer.
Right, exactly. That's what I mean by more casualties. It's not just that individual efforts are going to lead to moments of, of tragedy in the war effort. And there is an eerie parallel to the administration's bizarre behavior over the last 2+ years relating to Ukraine. Biden administration says we want Ukraine to win, and then spends 2 years negotiating with itself on what weaponry Ukraine should be allowed to have that isn't too dangerous. This is now 2 wars that we have supported. Okay, go ahead.
Well, no, there's that parallel, but when you were raising the idea of parallels, I thought of another one, which is it's similar to the Israel-Iran exchange of a few weeks ago, which the precedent was established that Iran can fire one of the largest salvos of ballistic missiles between 2 countries since World War II. And Israel can only respond by pounding sand and showing that it can go hit a radar installation in Isfahan, right? Iran is safe from a major reprisal. And if the Biden administration policy in Rafah is a success, Hamas will be safe. After killing 1,200 people, raping, mutilating, injuring thousands more, and carrying hundreds of hostages back to its dungeons, Hamas will be safe. The administration is now in a position where it is trying to prevent the end of Hamas. And that is just, it's despicable, but it's also completely politically self-defeating, it seems to me.
And there's also all this talk in the administration, these comments about, you can't. Yes, we support Israel's effort to get rid of Hamas, but you can't eradicate an idea militarily.
Well, here's a comparison.
That's John Kirby. So, Joe, we have been nothing but praise for John Kirby since October 7th, the White House spokesman. But he did say this astonishing thing the other day. That's what, Abe, what you're alluding to, where he said, well, you can't use military means to eradicate an ideology. Really? 1945? Does Nazism as a functioning governmentally dominating ideology still exist? It does not. Does fascism in Italian form still exist? No. Does
And
the
not just that, but
God-centered does the God Emperor of Japan is the Emperor of Japan still the God Emperor of Japan running a totalitarian militaristic regime? No, we have examples in not in our living memory, but in living memory of ideologies that take over countries being defeated. And this is the line that
but
the
also I
White House press
just want to
spokesman
add
takes.
that even if we didn't have all these examples, the proper response to that is so what? In other words,
Yeah.
they pose this is an enemy of civilization who's attacking you.
Right.
So what that you believe you can or can't, who cares if you believe you can or can't eradicate an ideology through military means? You still have to fight back. You're not going to militarily engage a terrorist army because you can't defeat their idea. Like I think it's wrong. I mean, I wrote a post on this, a couple months ago when this was going around, and then talked about ISIS also and what we did in
Yeah.
Mosul and Iraq and all that stuff. But the point is that it's never stopped anybody from defending themselves because they say, oh, I don't know if we can defeat this idea with military means. You're fighting an army. Defeat the
Also,
army.
by the way, you know what we did in fighting ISIS? We dropped 2,000-pound bombs, the very bombs that the administration now claims are too indiscriminate for Israel to use. And we have a whole article that everyone should read in the April issue of Commentary. So you can find it online by David Adesnik and Mark Montgomery, called "The Big Lies About Israel's Big Bombs," and it breaks down this whole false narrative about how the 2,000-pound bombs, when you drop them, there's a quarter-mile blast radius, and how dangerous they are. And this has been repeated by every outlet after every outlet, but they don't acknowledge in reporting this that there are many ways to mitigate the maximum damage that a big bomb can inflict. You can play with the velocity and the angle. Depends when you drop it, where you drop it. You can set the fuse to detonate underground, which creates far less damage. And these are all things that have been done by us, by Israel. This is how you use them. And it's particularly disgusting to withhold these because Israel, more than anyone else, needs such bombs because their enemy has built extensive tunnels underground, bunkered where they need such weaponry to penetrate.
It's a great summary. Can I just make one other comparison? We had a group of Krauthammer Tikva fellows at AEI to talk about Charles Krauthammer's foreign policy here earlier in the week, and in my contribution, I brought up a column he wrote in the 1990s when the Watergate tapes were really being released and uncensored, and people had a kind of a front row seat audio experience with Richard Nixon's anti-Semitism and bigotry. And Nixon was not a fan of the Jewish people in private discussions, including in private discussions with his Jewish national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. But Krauthammer at the time in the 90s made the point that, look, this is all true. This is how he talked. But don't look at what he was saying. Look at what he was doing. And when the moment of crisis arrived in 1973, it was Nixon, more than anyone, more than Kissinger, who made sure that the munitions went to Israel when Israel was under attack. And it was Nixon who, in the middle of Watergate, kind of summoned the strength to rally the West to protect Israel. And the juxtaposition struck me yesterday listening to Biden. Okay, listen to Biden's words throughout this whole time. For the most part, since October 7th, the words have been fine. But then you look at what he's doing, and it's been a mess. an increasingly messier situation in recent months as Israel has gotten closer to eliminating the final Hamas brigades in Rafah. So we have to stress that, the words about Holocaust Remembrance Day, I thought were very good, as I said. And he quoted all the right people, as Seth said. But the deeds now are becoming very disturbing for anyone who wants to ensure the survival of Israel and the continuity of the Jewish people.
In 2011, when it was decided that it was necessary for the West to take on Libya. Remember, I talked yesterday, if you were listening yesterday, about what I said was a democratic fetish, liberal democratic fetish for negotiating, and that this is a 3-generation thing where negotiation becomes an end in itself rather than a tool to achieve an aim that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't and needs to be attempted, but it cannot be its own justification, because otherwise then it's simply being used as a weapon by a bad actor on the other side who was negotiating in bad faith simply to stall you or control you. And then I was thinking about what happened when this international coalition decided that it needed to go into Libya. And this was the notorious moment when some administration official said, in allowing, I think it was the French to be the lead actor, the lead military actor, that we were leading from behind, right? That was the phrase. So one of the notorious phrases of the 2010s was that we were leading from behind. And it was like, what? We're America. We shouldn't lead from behind. This is terrible. But there was a practical consequence to the decision to let the French be the lead force in bombing Tripoli or doing whatever was going on. And it works like this. Munitions, particularly bombs and things from the air, there are gradations of values of those munitions and the precision that they achieve. And the simple fact of the matter is, if you want precision bombing to limit collateral damage and do exactly what you want the bomb to do, hit exactly the target you want it to hit in the way you want it to be hit so that it isolates on command and control, leadership, and leaves the civilian population relatively unmolested. The United States has to be the one to drop the bombs, because we have achieved, this was what I was told in 2011 by people who knew. I don't remember who. I would happily say, if my memory, like Joe Biden's, weren't imperfect now, but that we had achieved in general terms 90% accuracy at our highest level of new bomb when we wanted to hit. In World War II, the most bombed moment in world history, overall between the Germans and us and the whatever, bombing had a 25 to 50% accuracy, meaning you dropped a bomb, you really didn't know where it was going to land, and you were lucky if it got anywhere near, and the collateral damage was astounding, right? It was all in a good cause, right? It was all for defeat Nazism and the Japanese and everything. But we've spent 80 years getting our aerial munitions to a point at which we know when they fall, where they're going to hit exactly, and we can guide them on the way using telemetry and things like that, which did not used to be something that you could do. When we let the French lead and we led from behind, we increased the damage being done to ordinary Libyans. We made the war messier. We made its, it was more ambiguous. And I'm wondering, so this is essentially what we've done a bit in Ukraine and what we're now doing in Israel, which is deny them the ability and the capacity to use the most precise means to hit something, right? And that's what we're doing right now. It's like, don't go into if you go, you're not going to have this to use. So it's on you if you drop a bomb and it goes awry, because we're not giving you the telemetry to put on the bomb. Okay. So this is overall of a piece with this thing that we have been edging toward as we discuss the United States and its involvement in Israel's war in Gaza and in Ukraine. We don't win wars. The United States stopped winning wars in 1953. We fight wars to an ambiguous semi-conclusion. In almost every case, that has been the case. Korea, Vietnam, first Iraq. I mean, we had a defined mission in the first Gulf War, right, which was to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And we did that, but we didn't take out the Hussein regime, and so we went back in 12 years later. We have an indeterminate result there. It wasn't a loss, which people seem to think. And of course, there was Afghanistan. And Democrats who ended these wars, right? It was Obama who ended the war in Iraq effectively. Biden who ended the war in Afghanistan. It wasn't. It was the earlier ones were ended by Republicans, Eisenhower and Ford, but or we just lost Vietnam outright. But we do not fight wars to conclusions. Israel said on October 8th they were going to destroy Hamas. They had a specific military goal, and now we see this problem of our relationship to what should be the case in any war, which is a clearly defined objective that requires the commission of tens or hundreds of thousands of soldiers and arms to do this horrible, gruesome, nasty, monstrous thing, because you need to achieve this aim. And that's not how the United States fights wars now. And now we are imposing this on Israel, and in some sense opposing it on Ukraine, although last year we wanted them to win, so we told them to do this invasion where they would go and try to get to the land bridge from, and break through the Russian lines, while not providing them with sufficient means to do so that we had and we could have given them. Okay, so
we prohibited them not prohibited them, but we said don't shoot anything that could spike gas prices.
Right.
So don't hurt Russia too bad.
Right. So I just think that that something fundamental has happened here in the last week and a half, which is that this deep American thing about war, which is we got to do it, and then it gets hard, and then we're like, we got to figure out a way to do this less, or to do it with a lighter footprint. The light footprint, right? That was the big thing. Light footprints. Even Donald Rumsfeld. We need a Pentagon with a light footprint. Well, is that really? Can war have a light footprint? I mean, maybe what you need is a really, 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 really heavy footprint, but you have it as fast as possible and as devastating as possible in quick order and as precise as possible. And then the enemy reels, and they come out with a white flag looking for terms of surrender.
I'm reminded of when before Barack Obama was saved by Russia from having to deal with Syria for crossing the chemical weapons red line. So John Kerry was talking about how we were going to hit Syria with unbelievably small, was his word. Yeah. Unbelievably small. We're talking about an unbelievably small attack.
Yeah. And I mean, look, it's not just Biden.
Well, that's like the flip side of that. I'm sorry. Yeah. The flip side of that is when Biden said, in the fall of 21, that if Putin went in with a minor incursion, well, that would be different than a big invasion. So if it's small, the Democrats are okay with it, whether it's our side or our enemy side.
It's like
But I mean,
they're thinking in military action in terms of like it's an ongoing conversation that countries are having, you
Yeah.
know?
Well,
And,
no, or
and
manners. You know, you
yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to
yeah,
be
yeah,
outre and kind of
yeah,
really loud when you start
yeah.
wars.
right,
You
right.
know, you need to be civil and polite and make small, minute gestures.
Well, that raises, by the way, a really good question about Israel's strategy in Gaza and what the United States has been pressuring them to do. I'm reading the news stories about how Hamas groups are getting sort of back on their feet, and we saw the idea they hijacked the aid caravan the other day, and in one of the stories it said, this was the first real successful Hamas move in up through to the area where Israel has bisected Gaza and drawn a horizontal, not exactly horizontal, but a horizontal line across Gaza, split it between north and south, and has occupied the road that separates the two. And it makes you wonder if the allergy to the word occupation and the concept of occupation, military or otherwise, has also had the same effect on this, which is that every news story is like, well, where there were Israelis, things have been quiet. And we saw there was a heat wave last week or the week before. We saw them, a few miles away from that road where Israel had, what is specifically known as an occupation force protecting that road. A few miles away, Gazans flooded the beach on a hot day. So, and we talk about also, I think the same thing is true with the pier, right? We don't want to give Israel, we don't want to make it seem like Israel controls everything that comes through the borders and every passageway into Gaza. But maybe we should. Maybe the effective means would be not to fear a military occupation and this the light footprint idea, but maybe it would be safer and save lives if you had more stations where Israeli troops were making it safe enough for thousands of Gazans to go to the beach.
You are making such an elemental point as you were speaking that I was thinking, as I say, I think we have this allergy to fighting wars to victorious conclusions for very complicated reasons. I mean, in the case of Korea, it was that going any further, we really didn't know what the war aims or interests were, either of China or of the Soviet Union, how far they would go. We were just in the very, very beginning of the Cold War, and prudence dictated that this challenge, which MacArthur obviously wanted to do, right? Truman fired MacArthur because he wanted to invade China, Red China, and Truman was like, "Okay, Douglas, you're gone. You're the greatest war hero we've ever seen, and I can't have you anymore. Your policies here are threatening to world order." So there were all kinds of reasons why we did not fight things to conclusions, and we couldn't in Vietnam because we lost Vietnam, really. But when you mention this about occupation, think about Iraq. So terrified was the famous hawkish, monstrous Bush administration that lied our way into war. What did the Pentagon want? The Pentagon, under Donald Rumsfeld, wanted to get out of Iraq 2 months after we went into Iraq with 250,000 troops and took out their regime that had been governing the country for almost 35 years, leaving them with nothing. No governmental structures, no good working order for infrastructure, how to get supplies around or anything like that. And they were all like, we're going to have a Loya Jirga. We're going to appoint, a guy as the head of the community thing. And then we're getting the hell out of here. Because the thought of being the occupier or the colonizer was so terrifying to them. And administrating an area that you have, for very good reason, had to devastate in order to achieve your aim is like a fundamentally moral thing to do. You don't just leave the place, you don't leave the place in ruins and then say, okay, now you guys all clean it up. You try to take some role in it. And this is why what's going to happen with Israel after it defeats Hamas, which I believe it will. It's going to get very complicated because Gaza is going to have to be rebuilt in some fashion. And Israel cannot allow, by the way, Gaza to help to rebuild itself with no Israeli input, because they'll just build another tunnel city if we're not careful or something like that. Like, they have to be part of the plan as part of the pacification effort that will follow the war. But we are living in this cognitive dissonance where it's like, no one can occupy anything. Where is it best in Gaza now? Like you say, Gazans can go to the beach because Israel, in some ways, is even protecting them from Hamas now, ordinary Gazans. And so we are in a very bad mind space when it comes to these actions. And I think it gives some space, I have to say, horrifying though I think, is like when serious isolationists or people who really do look and say war is not helpful or war is bad or something, or people that I genuinely respect who have these deep feelings, like my friend Michael Brendan Doherty or something like that. I mean, he's not without reason based on the results of the last 20 years of serious warfare in the world, because wars are fought to indeterminate conclusions, and then you look back and you say, what was it worth it? And that can be a hard question to answer. I would say, by the way, that the 20 years of relative peace and freedom enjoyed by the Afghani people, despite bad government and corruption and this and whatever you want to call it, and Taliban terrorism, was that generation worth it for the people of Afghanistan who were released from the Taliban yoke and girls could go to school and all of that? I ask them.
Well, and it was also worth it, John, for Americans who did not have a major attack on our soil launched from Afghanistan and from the al-Qaeda terrorists who have now reconstituted in Afghanistan under Taliban rule.
I'd say it was worth it had we not pulled out.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, the pulling out was took a generation of people who had been free and shackled them again under Taliban rule. So,
and we all know people who served in those wars, and to a man, you talk to any of them, and they all are pretty disillusioned in sort of retrospect because of the pullout too. In other words, the sacrifices that we sent people to make, the people who survived, that war, are asking what they fought for, and it was a very long war to not know what you're fighting for. They thought they knew, and then there was like this erasure at the end where it was like, let's just get out of there. Right. And so there's a morale issue here. Of course.
Also. Well, look, John Kerry, the most famous thing that John Kerry ever said, aside from I voted for the 87 billion before I voted against it, or the other way around, was this thing he said when he came back and became a veteran against the war, when he said, who is going to be the last person to die for a mistake? Right. And you look back at Vietnam and you say, once again, there was something that catches in your conscience. Like, if it was clear by 1970 that Vietnam was going to be fought to no good end, the 5 years that led up to the final collapse and takeover and all of that really were like, this was a horrible, monstrous tragedy. It's tragedy that people were still there and fighting in that way. But this is the opposite in Afghanistan, which is they believed that this was the people who fought in that war believed that it was a just war. And they were proud of, obviously it was a mess and chaos and everything. But the ones that I know were proud that they had done something not only to defend their country from further terrorist assault, but that they had been doing things to help build some form of civil society in all kinds of places, even if not everywhere. And so it's not that they died for a mistake. They died for something good that they believed in. And then Joe Biden decided that it was a mistake. Now, he didn't say it was a mistake, right? He said it's been enough. It's 20 years and it's enough. But effectively, Taliban take over, and then it's like, was this all for nothing? And they didn't think that it was for nothing.
Well, look, just bringing it back to Israel for a second. Let's say Biden succeeds in pressuring Netanyahu to sign a ceasefire, and then there's further pressure to continue the ceasefire indefinitely. And Hamas's strategy of using its civilian population and the hostages as basically human shields to insulate itself from full Israeli reprisal succeeds. How will the IDF soldiers who have been in Gaza, who have taken hundreds of casualties since October 7th, how will their brethren feel, or how will their parents feel, if this war is not brought to an ultimate conclusion? And by the way, the towns in the northern sector are still evacuated.
Well, we haven't even gotten to that second phase of the war.
The potential for political earthquakes in Israel is absolutely huge if we continue down this path.
Look, my sister Ruthie told me that she was watching TV last night in Israel, and that the parent of a hostage came on to be interviewed. I don't remember his name, and he said, "I have 4 children. One of them is hostage in Gaza, but I have 3 others. If Hamas survives, they're at risk. This is a horrible Hobson's choice here, because, of course, I want my son to be saved, but I don't want my country to live under this threat, and I don't want my children who are here to be in existential peril. So don't hand me that the hostage families are all of one mind either, necessarily, or that there is a simple calculus here. Now, in fact, what may happen, I mean, this is a long shot probably, but Israel is now in Rafah. So it hasn't gone into Rafah specifically. It's taken over the crossing into Egypt, and it is laying, the groundwork for the invasion. And maybe it's possible, while they're negotiating in wherever they're negotiating, that they're going to say, okay, look, you have 48 hours. We will declare a ceasefire for 6 months. You give us all the hostages. If not, every single one of you is going to be dead in 3 months. And we're not going to stop. And the Americans aren't going to stop us. And you're not going to stop us. And nobody is going to stop us. And we will do what we have to do. Can they scare Hamas into doing that? Well, we don't know. Maybe. Hamas gave up 40 hostages when they were under the most hellacious bombardment and invasion after a month. Right? Israel went in like October 27th. By November 27th, there was this ceasefire and 40 hostages were gotten out because Hamas was like, whoa, hold up there. Like, we can't, let's see if we can maybe take a little breather here. That happened. Then what happened is that the war stalled, and Hamas has no incentive not to push and sort of a maximalist position here. But maybe the next couple of days will tell. Maybe Israel can scare Sinwar and the people and say, like, you are never seeing the sky again. You have been
hostage
underground.
Video last week too.
Right, but
Hamas released proof of life of they played an incredibly valuable card of which they don't have any more of threats of that level, because they understood that the invasion was really imminent.
Right.
John, your scenario would be more plausible if the patron, the United States, were unequivocally backing Israel's negotiating position.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. And that is what has stalled the war more than anything else, I'm convinced.
Okay, so I have a, as you guys know, I have a piece in the current issue of Commentary called Israel's Splendid Isolation. And now let me just go 30,000 feet and say, if you look at the course of Israeli history, and you look at the world in which people say Israel is isolated. Israel's being isolated it's isolated by the annexation of the Golan Heights. It's isolated by its brutal treatment of the Palestinians. It's isolated by this and it's isolated by that. And world opinion just constantly declaring Israel better be careful about its isolation. And now it's facing the prospect of feeling a real isolation from the United States after the very welcome several months in which Israel felt supported by the United States, grateful to Biden for his support, grateful to Congress, for giving the aid and all of that. Well, what is the history of Israel's splendid isolation? As I say in the piece, in 1967, when Israel was isolated and had to go it alone in its war, in the Six-Day War that it won so triumphantly, Israel's gross domestic product was $4 billion, and it is now $535 billion 3 generations later. The economy of the country is 100 times larger than it was in 1967. Is it any more or less isolated? No, it's actually less isolated, because as it grew more and more and more successful, other countries in the world thought, they know something about how to do things, and the Palestinians are a dead letter and they're a bunch of losers. Maybe we can make some good juju with the Israelis, and that includes the UAE, and implicitly it includes Saudi Arabia, with whom Israel does not have a officially normalized relationship, but with whom it has been coordinating so much so that Saudi Arabia is now arresting people for being openly anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. It happened last week, like really weird stuff going on there. So if Israel has to dare its isolation from the United States now, the historical record says it'll survive and thrive just fine. And the best thing for Israel, for its existential future, for its diplomatic future, and for everything, even if Tony Blinken and Biden and Jake Sullivan and whoever else think that it would be really terrible for Israel to go into Rafah and all that, is for Israel to win. And the worst thing for Israel would be if Israel were to be in a position where Hamas could declare victory. So Israel has a long history of not allowing its isolation to hold it back. And now it's going to face a very difficult, I fear, and I'm heartsick that they are maybe put in this position of having to actually be publicly crosswise of the United States at this critical moment, particularly with all the anti-Semitic ferment on the ground in the United States, and the fact that who knows what will happen if Biden actually publicly turns on Israel, what kind of accelerant that will give to the long, hot summer of anti-Semitic protest. But they got to go into Rafah and finish the war.
Jewish tourists in Greece, in the hotel in Greece, and the Dagestan, attempted pogrom when they heard a plane was coming. All over the world, even the far more violent versions of this.
And there's this footage that I saw yesterday in Amsterdam of these Jews getting set upon by guys who seem to have some kind of baseball bat. I mean, I don't know what it was, being hit over the head, and there are 5 cops standing there and they're doing nothing. So yeah, things can get really bad, but nothing would be worse than Hamas being able to declare victory over Israel. Nothing would be worse. Bad relationships with the United States, whatever. And the only thing I'll then in the end of this monologue say is, Joe Biden and his people would not only be moral idiots in this case, but they would be political idiots because they would have wasted all this capital defending Israel and then pulling back because of Dearborn, Michigan and the youth vote and everything like that. And do you think ordinary Americans on the fence who still say they 80-20 support Israel over Hamas and don't like, I assume, the sights and sounds that they're hearing from the encampments and the protests everywhere and stuff that's going to go on this summer, you think that's going to redound to Biden's political benefit in November? He's walking himself into a buzzsaw.
Well, he can't see where he's going. That's probably the reason. It's kind of stumbling, shuffling. He's shuffling along, and his aides are obscuring his view as he goes into the political buzzsaw.
Also, by the way, we should note the Axios poll yesterday that most college students also don't care about this.
Right. What is it? Yeah. If you ask them what their list,
they gave them the whole list.
They care about.
Yeah. The list of issues, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now we got 9 issues here. And the conflict in the Middle East is the literal bottom of that. So we should also mention that 13% college students saying that this is the major issue to them this year, in the midst of at the point at which that number should be and likely is at its highest.
Okay,
right? It's not going to get higher than 13%.
It's math time. It's math time here on the commentary pod, and we're so good at math. Okay, but let's just try to do the math here. 13%, if you take this literally, 13% of college students say this is the number one issue. Okay, college is 4 years in length, right? So there are every year 5 million people are born in the United States. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that on a college campus right now, the overall American cohort is 20 million people. Okay, of whom 30 to 40% are in or around college. So 20 million people, 30% of them, right, is, I don't know, what is that, 6 million? Something like that. Am I right? Out of 30%, 8 million? Okay. 8 million around college campuses, let's just say. And of them, 13% say that this is their number one issue. So that's like 800,000 people. So this is what's directing America. This is what's terrifying a person who got 81 million votes in 2020 is that there are 800,000 kids, most of whom are not going to vote, or 50% of whom are. So now it's down to 400,000 people.
Right. That's
nationwide,
the key.
By the way.
That's the key, is that they're not reliable voters at all. And they're also going to, they go home to where they are. They're concentrated in certain areas. If they vote, it's because they stuck around college in New York, where they had friends and everybody who was like, let's go vote. When they go home to their swing state, they tend not to vote.
Right. So, but it's 400,000 people for whom this is a top issue, who are potential. Does anybody at the White House do math? I just did this from a standing start. This is insane. They're being crazy. The population of Dearborn, Michigan is 100,000 people.
How we have
they're turning American foreign policy on a dime because of 100,000 people in one town and 400,000 people nationwide who are psychotic? No, that's crazy. He got 81 million votes 4 years ago.
These categories in polls, likely voters. This category would be unlikely voters. That's who he's pandering. I'm winning among unlikely voters.
So once again, I go to you, Matt, and I just want to ask you this final question. Stupid, okay? The Biden people, I'm stipulating, and you're writing something about this. So what if the story is that I've said, but what if the story is just they really bad at this, in fact, and they're bad at politics in 2024, and they're making all kinds of dumb, self-defeating and self-destructive choices on the basis of the bubble that they live in and the fact that they all have children who are wearing, everyone who works in the White House has a kid who's wearing a keffiyeh on some Ivy League campus.
Well, I think you may have hit on the answer right there. The first thing I'd say is yes, it's a minority. It's a minority of college students, but history, especially history of the last 100 years or so, is the history of energized minorities having disproportionate consequences on world events. So it doesn't take many people to affect huge policy changes in the United States and beyond. And the second thing I'd say is the small numbers of protesters are magnified through a liberal media and through social media that makes their numbers seem much larger than they actually are. That is shaping the perceptions of the White House as they watch CNN and MSNBC, where the viewpoints of the Hamas sympathizers are often aired without challenge. And that they are also, this minority of students, could be a convenient excuse for a broader ideological project of distancing ourselves from Israel, of realigning our position in the Middle East, which, let us not forget, since the Obama years, has been trying to kind of play down our relationships with our historic partners in the region, Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and reach some sort of détente with Iran. And even though Biden himself doesn't seem to be an ideologue who really has internalized this position, this view of the world, many of the people who work for him are. And so as you say, John, the people whose kids are sleeping in the tents who work in the White House, or the incoming intern class, which may have a few of the tent sitters in it, they also may just have a predisposition to view Israel as the aggressor here, despite everything. And so I acknowledge, yes, that as the poll shows, this is a minority of students. A friend of mine just put it to me yesterday that some of these tent outposts are easily ignorable when walking on campus. It's not every campus either. But that might not matter in the long run, because they are clearly having an effect within the Democratic Party. And that effect on the Democratic Party has ramifications for the world.
Absolutely. I just want to, before we get to Matt's commentary recommends, watching the footage last night of police officers in Amherst, Massachusetts, clearing out the encampment at UMass Amherst under assault by the protesters. And I was just thinking, God bless those cops. Like, you don't think they have something better? You don't think they want to go home and watch something on TV, watch the basketball finals or whatever? And, there they are, thanklessly going through this encampment and, getting assaulted and yelled at and people jumping on their backs and things like that, simply because they are keeping public order, and these entitled little shitheads abusing them and yelling at them and treating them as though, they are worthless, when they're not worth one fingernail, one hair on the head of somebody who does what those cops do every day. I'm grateful for them. I don't live in Amherst, Massachusetts. I'm grateful for the fact that they are standing up for a public order and standing against this kind of decay and cultural and civilizational rot. And there is almost none of that, once again, in the mainstream media and among the elites, any sense of empathy or connection to the people who are now being called on to end this barbaric nonsense. And I wish there was a little more sense, and this was very much the case in the 1960s also, of what they have to go through and also the care they have to take now that everybody's got a camera and everybody's got a lawyer, and the care that they have to take not to lose their tempers, not to turn around. I mean, we not to be Larry David, and it, it's an almost supernatural kind of patience that you would have to display to go through this for hours here in the United States. And as I've said before, these are often people who themselves have served their country abroad in the two wars that we have fought in the last, 20 odd years. And, it's one thing for them to have to take abuse in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's another for them to take abuse from upper middle class, kids who, are the worst right now, are the worst of us. They have made it clear that they are the worst of us as Americans. And who are the best of us? The people who are facing them down. So, Matt, you have a commentary recommends.
Yes, thank you, John. Today, I'd like to recommend a book I've been reading with great interest and pleasure and about to finish. It's called The Backyard Bird Chronicles by the celebrated author Amy Tan. It is published by Penguin Random House. And Amy Tan, who's known for her novels about basically Chinese Americans, most famously The Joy Luck Club. None of them I've read, but I happened to pick up this book she just published, which is a journal she kept over the past several years while observing the birds in her Northern California home, outside her Northern California home, and drawing them. And as someone who likes in the mornings, in my few moments of free time before I have to come onto this podcast, and usually I'm just preparing for this podcast in the mornings, but sometimes I look up from the glow of my phone and I look outside and I look at my fresh growing trees and I see the birds out there, and I like to look at the birds. They're very beautiful. Well, Amy Tan has a lot more time to do that, and she not only drew the birds with just amazing skill. I mean, the illustrations in this book are wonderful. But she also wrote about her experiences with birds and how her birding had basically drove her crazy, because she begins caring for the birds and feeding the birds. And she describes the lengths to which she tries to achieve this goal. And it's quite humorous. My other takeaway is that, birds, they are lovely to look at. They're nice to listen to, if we're not talking about crows. But they also seem to be mean and stupid. And there's a lot of just... that the birds are not nice to each other, and it's very interesting. They're such creatures of habit. Tan says that even if she removes the bird feeder for a half hour, the birds arrive and they're puzzled. They have no idea what to do. And if she moved a bird feeder 2 feet from the position where she initially put it, birds would starve. They would not, because they would just go to the place where they had found the food initially and expect it to be there. And if just 2 feet away, they had no idea. So it's a humorous book in that sense, whereas you're looking at these beautiful drawings and you're learning about the different species of birds, and yet you're kind of reminded about how just bird-brained they really are.
On the mean question.
Yeah.
So in my neighborhood, Falcon, in a highly urban neighborhood, right on the Upper West Side, falcons showed up. There's a church on the corner of my block, and they took residence in I guess the belfry, which I don't think has a bell in it anymore. Which is about, I don't know, like would be 3 stories up or something like that. And from all over the place, photographers showed up on all 4 corners with these huge cameras. Apparently this is very striking, these falcons. You don't see falcons in cities, and it's all that. And they set up nests, and they've done it 2 or 3 times. They've, gone, I guess, south for the winter and then come back. And one of the net results of the fact that these falcons are living on our block is that they dive bomb and murder pigeons and eat them. And totally. So all over our neighborhood there are like, you'll see a feather,
pigeon
then you'll see a foot, you'll see like a bird's foot or like a little carcass. And if you have a dog, as I do, you have to be extra careful because you're like walking the dog. You don't want the dog eating some, some pigeon carcass meat left over.
Yeah.
God only knows what's in that. And so,
Or the
so
falcon
there's all
eating the
this,
dog.
oh,
by
the
the way.
falcon, the beautiful falcon.
are.
Falcon
They're
eating the
amazing.
dog is a
Wingspan.
natural risk too.
Yeah, well, that's true, right? Yeah,
We have these in our neighborhood where people have, we've walked outside and, my God, that I didn't know we had hawks in this area, and they're so beautiful. And a neighbor will say, "Yeah, I have to keep my dog inside because
I know
it's
friends
like
of mine. Friends of mine in Westchester have dachshunds. They will not allow outside, like, they won't like get an electronic fence and allow their dogs to run outside because in their neighborhood, hawks have been swooping down and like, taking these little dogs in their talons and flying them away to.
This recommends took some turn.
I know. Well, you know what?
Well, I just want to say before we close it, I know I'm going to hear from the bird people. Why did you call the birds mean and stupid? And I know that I'm sure they're very intelligent birds that are kept as pets, and they're apparently bird song can be highly sophisticated. I want to just acknowledge that for the record. But I am going to stick with my description.
Okay.
And despite that description, say how much I'm enjoying this book and how much I like looking at birds and learning about them and listening to them.
By the way, the Joy Luck
we love
Club
the bird community. We love.
I
the
didn't
bird-
say that. I didn't say that, Seth. I said I love the
community.
birds for my own reasons. And many birders are very nice people too. I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. And I just want to say the Joy Luck Club is a wonderful piece of popular literature, really one of the best published in the last 35 years or so. It's not like a high-end literary novel, but it is like an enormously satisfying multi-generational immigrant story. And if you haven't read it and you're looking for a book to read this summer, you could really not do much better if you're looking for that kind of novel you can sink into than the Joy Luck Club. So it's fun that you. And the name of the book again?
The Backyard Bird Chronicles by Amy Tan. And that's right. And this is my introduction to her writing. And I shouldn't even need to say it. She's a very good writer. And it makes me interested in reading the Joy Luck Club sometime in the future as well.
Okay, so we will be back tomorrow for Abe, Seth, and Matt. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.